Welcome back, everybody. For this video, we're going to go over Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So she was born in 1860 and she died in 1935. Her maiden name was Perkins. She was a leading theorist in the women's rights movement of the 1800s and especially in the early 1900s. Her father abandoned her family when she was a child. Now, that doesn't mean she had issues with men in general, but it certainly led to a difficult life for her and her mother and her family. In 1884, she married Charles Stetson and experienced what at the time they called melancholia, and it involved a complete nervous collapse. Happened around right after the time she had their first child, their young daughter. And now we would call this postpartum depression. But at the time, anything with a woman, it was called hysterics from the Greek word meaning uterus. That's where we get the word hysterectomy from as well. And her postpartum depression was so bad it caused her to have a complete nervous collapse. She did what women mostly of the day did, which is very similar to what happened in the story Yellow Wallpaper. We'll talk about that in this video as well. And so, but moving forward in 1888, 4 years later, she moved to California with her young daughter. And 6 years after that, she finally divorced Stetson. He remarried. And at that point, Charlotte sent her daughter to live with her father, which was scandalous for that time period that the daughter wouldn't remain with her mother because everyone believed that at that time period that a child really needed their mother more for the ability to be raised, especially into a good woman, would be to have her mother with her, or not just her daughter, but any children. So she began writing for newspapers, publishing stories. She began to also lecture on women's rights, including one thing that was very unique idea to her is that domestic duties and childcare should not necessarily mean that they are a mother's duty, that those best suited for the job should do it. That if a teacher teaches because they're best suited for the job, if a um mechanic, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, mechanic does his job is because we need a mechanic. Same thing today. We get specialized degrees to do special jobs or specialized training to do special jobs. So she felt that just because she is a wife, just because she gives birth to a child as her, you know, duty as a wife and wanting to be a mother, it didn't mean that the only thing there was for her was domestic duties and full-time childcare. Now, part of this is, again, part of the women's rights movements of what led up to today, where we have women who are able to work and be a mom. We have women who are recognizing that women were not just put on this planet to be broodmares, they are meant to be people too. And so that was the beginning of this thinking, but she also extended it to house duties as well. That just because, you know, domestic duties are something that mothers usually do, it doesn't mean they should have to do it. It's not necessarily the mother's duty. Now, this could be, at this time period, it's a nice idea, but not everybody at this time period even could afford to have their own maid. Even the maid couldn't afford to have her own maid. So it was a nice idea, but it was very much a classist idea. She eventually marries a second time to George Gilman in 1900, and she was diagnosed with cancer in the 1930s. She began treatments that were very ineffective, and at this point, rather than suffer a long drawn out death, she chose to end her life herself to basically get out of the pain. So we get the story of the yellow wallpaper that she writes in 1892. So this is in between the time that she's moved to California with her young daughter, but before she has divorced her first husband. So again, feelings about the story, I've it's not just about what you liked or didn't like about the story. Obviously, that's important, but also, what did it make you feel? How did it make you see differently on a situation? Um, Especially when I read a story that has a first person narrator. We talked about this with Montresor, that it, I'm automatically suspicious of them because I know that first person narrators are not always the best to tell us the truth, but it's always fascinating to me to see the story through their eyes and their perception compared to what it would be like from a third person perception that's more neutral. So we see a lot of connections to Gilman's life in this story. There, the woman in the story, she has a young daughter. She is on bed rest and nothing else, basically, for we're not sure what, but we know it's not an illness. It seems to be probably melancholia or probably postpartum depression. And this was the common treatment of the time, that, okay, we'll just isolate the woman and then she'll get better and things will go back to normal. And it's obviously, we know now, that is not the right treatment for someone suffering from postpartum depression. But we'll get into that. The setting itself is we don't really know the time period. It's probably around the same time period as that Gilman lived during. Um, but we mostly get the physical setting. So we get this house that in and of itself is isolated from, because it's out in the country, away from everyone else. And then it's clearly not their house, they're visiting it. And she's in a room by herself the entire time of the story. And we know from COVID that isolation doesn't do well on a person's mental health, whether they had mental health problems previously or not. So you can kind of connect to that even if you can't connect to the postpartum um, depression. So the narrator, like I said, is very much a representation of Gilman. She had doctors around her all the time telling her what was going on with her. And it they clearly weren't listening to her and they didn't really know what was truly going on with her. Her husband, John, I like to call him Dr. Know-It-All, but it's because doctors at this time, sometimes even now, know medicine is based on the default of the white male body. Because when we started treating things, it was the white male that we cared about treating. And then that was the treatises throughout history. And if a woman didn't match the symptoms, if a minority doesn't match the symptoms that are textbook, which again is white male, then they would either dismiss it or it would get misdiagnosed or diagnosed way too late. So today, even, this is why women often get misdiagnoses, is because we still haven't completely updated for every disease known to man. And, even there's variety between individuals. Two women might have different symptoms of the same disease. Two people who are related to each other might have different symptoms of the same disease, that it's hard to diagnose. That's why medicine is called a practice. But it is, especially at her time period, medicine is a practice that is very misogynistic and very racist. So, of course, her doctor and her brother in the story both are, or her husband and her brother, both are doctors and both agree that it's melancholia and that this is the best form of treatment for her. Whereas other women, if they were doctors at the time, having dealt with this themselves, might have said, no, this is not what needs to be done. This is what we would recommend. We also have the character of the woman in the wallpaper. And I say it as a separate character, but in reality, many people see the woman in the wallpaper as the narrator herself, that it's not this separate character, creature thing that she is seeing, but in reality, it is her shadow that she is seeing. And it has driven her insane, that from the isolation of this person is following me everywhere that I go, and it's making the narrator very paranoid. We also have these two very minor characters they're briefly mentioned in the story, but I thought they're interesting to bring up. Jenny takes care of the house, and Mary takes care of the child while the narrator is ill. So the fact that Gilman chose the name Mary is symbolic in and of itself, because we have the Virgin Mary, who in at least Christianity is considered the perfect mother. So that leads to the idea of, again, that the narrator has two people who are perfect to do the jobs of managing the house and child rearing. Why would she need to do it? Obviously, she needs to do something, because not allowing her to do anything is making the depression worse and the descent into madness. But she may not be well suited to child rearing and managing the house if it put her in this state in the first place. Some symbolisms elsewise in the story, the wallpaper pattern has bars on the pattern. That kind of shows the confinement. So that idea of bars really represents the confinement that she feels. She is confined to that one room. She's not allowed to, wander the house. Other stories that we read at this time period of the 1800s, if we think about Jane Austen, even in the 1700s, when someone got ill, they were still, unless they were bedridden, they were still able to, read and, write letters to people. They were allowed to wander about the house and grounds. Our narrator is not allowed to do any of that. So she's really confined to that one room. The paper that she has, kind of, it's a meta symbolism. She's writing in her journal what's going on, her story, and clearly by writing her story down and sharing it with others is how Gilman coped with what happened to her and was able to process the feelings. And a lot of people feel with mental illness and mental disorders that writing is a coping mechanism. It is something that allows us to, maybe without talking to someone else, process our ideas, process what happened to us, even if we're not ready to share it with others yet. And then maybe it will prepare us as the moon is a way that we know the passage of time throughout the story, but it's also an interesting symbol because it relates back to the ancient pagan tradition, especially the Celtic pagan tradition, but they had a symbol of the triple moon. So that is the two crescents on either side of a full moon facing opposite ways. And this triple moon in paganism is used to represent the three stages of a woman. Because the big thing in paganism is that there's both a god and a goddess. And the three stages of a woman, the waxing moon, the first moon, is the maiden. She is growing up, she is becoming a young woman, she's preparing herself to take on her role in the middle as the mother, the full moon. So obviously, full moon representing the pregnant woman. And then the waning moon shows that after she has had her time as a mother, she is starting to go into the stage of what they call the crone, or basically the older, wizened woman. So it's an interesting symbol of she's in the stage of the mother, but she's still very much the mindset of the maiden, of not ready to become a mother or ready to be past that time of being a mother. And it's an interesting symbol in there if we think about it as well. But also, something that always, I look at, if we know that she's up all night seeing the moon and not sleeping because the moon is making it that she can't sleep, and then she's up all day because John wants to see her improvement and not have her sleep all day, that leads to sleep deprivation. And if you've ever gone more than 24 hours without sleep, you know that does weird things to your mind. Um, Even if you haven't gone more than 24 hours without sleep, sometimes when you're falling asleep, you can have those weird things pop into your vision that you can't tell if they're real or not. You can hear weird sounds because, again, your body's starting to fall asleep. It's starting to go into that dream phase. So you start imagining things that are not there because it's part of your dream, even though you're still partially awake. So, this sleep deprivation, though, we could live without food for a few days. We could live, we really can't live without water for too long, but sleep at most 2 to 3 days without complete and utter decaying of the brain and the mind because we need sleep to function. It's how we process everything we experience throughout the day, sight, sounds, memories, and it's how we take meaning from everything around us through that processing in our sleep, but it also refreshes us and allows us the ability to think more clearly, to process what's going on during the daytime when we're awake so we can process things a little bit as they happen and then fully process them later as we sleep. So, if she's already having postpartum depression and she's isolated and she's not sleeping, all of this shows that it's really not going to help her mental state, which we see through the story because it's really a interesting view of the descent into madness. The house itself, we said, it's isolated in the country, which might be helpful to the appearance that you don't want to show your weakness, to all your London friends or all your big city friends. But it's also hurtful because she doesn't have other women there with her who might have experienced the same thing as her to help her through this time period. Also, uh, interesting tidbit I always have paid attention to is the bed is chained to the floor. And supposedly this was previously a children's room. So why would, such a room have such a bed? And a lot of this goes to the fact that obviously if it's chained to the floor, this house is meant to be rented out for women who experience melancholia after birth to be able to isolate them in such a way that, there's bars in the window, they can't hurt themselves if the bed is chained to the ground. But it also reminds me of how the descriptions of the time period of an insane asylum, you know, it reminds me very much like that, like solitary confinement, that everyone's afraid she's going to hurt herself and or someone else. And again, work with someone. Now, we didn't have a lot by way of psychology at this time period, but even then, if writing was making her better, then she should have been allowed to write because it was helping her cope. For themes, we get a big theme of freedom and confinement, obviously, just by the fact that she's kind of kept within this one room. And in reality, it's not, I don't see her being free at the end of the story, but breaking through the wallpaper, it almost seems like she feels more free than she has, when in reality, she's confined by her mind. And sometimes that's the hardest thing to fight against, having to fight against oneself, one's own mind, to be able to live and process what's going on around you. It's one of the toughest battles that anyone can ever experience. We get obviously a big theme of madness because she sees the character. We also, it's very interesting that in a way that we can't trust the narrator, she's not crazy. And I hate that word with people for people with mental illness or experiencing mental health difficulties. And it's that she's unreliable because she doesn't recognize what's going on. So when she sneaks the writing every once in a while before it gets stolen from her, she's like, "Oh, I think I'm getting better without all this stuff, doing all this stuff that John says." And in reality, we know clearly she isn't, because if she were, it wouldn't have ended the way that it did. It has a big theme of gender and the way that women are treated at this time period and healthcare for women. Like I said, it's kind of a meta-analysis of literature and writing, because writing is used to write down her story, what's going on to her by her journaling, and it's very much representative of how Gilman wrote down her story, and it helped her not only to process what she went through, but in sharing it with other women, it made people realize they weren't alone. And for any man who read the story, made them realize maybe this isn't the best treatment for women. If all these women are saying this is how I felt, you know, it didn't make me feel better. But it's also got a good theme of society and class, because a working woman would not be able to afford to suddenly go out into the middle of the country and not do anything all day. And also, a working woman would have to, be a maid or be a seamstress, or, do different things in order to help earn money for the family. So this idea of, well, women should be allowed to do other things was very much a high class problem. Today we might joke and say first world problem. It was a high class problem at that time period. The style is an ironic indirection. We think the narrator is getting better when she is actually getting worse. So again, this is that irony of where we think one thing's going to happen and it happens the exact opposite. But it's also an interesting study, like I said, because to study the mind and what happens to someone, usually in that particular time period that someone's going through a mental health crisis, they don't think to write down it, and it shouldn't be, because they need to get through their crisis and survive the crisis, survive that battle, and deal with what's going on around them. But for many psychologists, it's an interesting study to see how the mind perceives what's going on around it. So that is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and we'll go over some more stories to help you study. Thanks and have a great day.